like, oh, please look here for climate information.
Yeah, it was like a UN climate warning thing, and it just gave I some of the way that it phrased it was kind of weird. Um, I can find it in a second. Maybe I'll look for it while you're doing the solid ground intro,
Okay,
Deborah.
I'm
But
ready.
today we're here with Melanie Bennet, and Melanie is a podcaster. And how would you describe yourself? I would say a parent's advocate, but what would you say? That would have been my
I
quick
really struggle with
phrase.
that because ultimately I'm a parent and
Mhm.
I came across some odd and objectionable ideas amongst my own family, and I had to investigate them. And so I've sort of, yeah, I guess parents advocate. I work with many parents and investigate the ideological capture of the Canadian school system, but also at the minute looking at a lot of queer theory and how that presents in Canada. So I don't know. I have a background in research, and so I've just been spending a lot of time researching and try to share these ideas with the Canadian public, really, and anyone else who wants to listen.
Well, and I'm glad you do. It's really necessary to get these ideas out there and show people what's actually going on. And I we spoke with you, I guess it was a couple weeks ago now. Benjamin and I spoke with you, and we had this really great conversation, and it went all over the place. And at one point, you were talking about your background in STEM education, and when you were in school studying at university and studying climate science, there was this really interesting propagandistic flavor to it. Like, I want you guys to go out and become influencers and start YouTube channels and talk about this. And we sort of talked about that for just a little bit, and we never got into science around it. We never got into anything to do with climate change. It was just about that aspect of your education. And lo and behold, however they use their AI to find out what we talk about, because it's this little tiny bitty piece sandwiched in between this longer conversation. But that was the thing that YouTube chose to pick on. And so the episode itself got a climate like notification right on the front of it. So that was really interesting. It seemed to prove your point.
Yeah, I think I
But
did talk a little bit about the projections and
the
some of the issues at the time that were known about the projections. Now,
mm-hmm.
I have not worked in climate change for many years, so I'm not really up to date on some of the progressions, but we did talk about, you said propagandist. It's interesting. I don't know if I would take it that far. And we were encouraged by some profs to take advantage of new technologies at the time in social media. So YouTube was, I think, was fairly new, and they were encouraging us to maybe communicate the science that we were learning. But I don't think the intention was necessarily propagandist. Um, but you can see that growth since, I don't know, 2008 to now. A lot of science communicators, but over time they've become a little bit ideological in the messaging around the science, right? So I think had I become a science communication podcaster, I possibly wouldn't be talking to you today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess, okay, so information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. So it is biased. We could argue about whether it's misleading or not. That I don't know.
Yeah, it would have been biased. I mean, the point was you guys are receiving an education at the time. Okay, so at the time in the UK, I think the context is important. The I think I mentioned the climate gate scandal when I was speaking to you in Benjamin, and that was a big deal at the time. And there was a lot of talk about climate change denial. There's a pushback from certain people on the narrative of climate change at the time, and so they were encouraging us to. Our lecturers kind of felt that it's because people don't have enough information, and people, not everyone receives a STEM education, and so it's important to do science communication so that people have a better grounding in science and they can understand the situation better. So I guess in that sense there is a bias. It was trying to the idea was to try to educate people, and it was a pushback against climate change denial of that era.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found Deborah, well, here, let me read this and then we can do the solid ground. So I found the warning or the notice that was put on our video, and it was UN climate action, UN.org. And the heading was, "What is climate change? Climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns. Such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic," oh, go away, what's going on, "for volcanic eruptions. But since the 1800s, human activities," and this part is underlined, "human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas." So that was the notice that they put on that video, which was interesting.
Yeah, we didn't talk about any of that.
No. No, it is interesting. It was funny to me to see that. And people who listened to just like the first chunk of the video were left very confused. Why did they put a climate change warning on this? All right. So before we go on, Deborah, do you want to give the Solid Ground blurb?
Yes. Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice and or COVID mandates in their workplace, university, children's school, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies and answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join one of our groups for only $5 a month. To find out how to join our community, please visit solidgroundsupport.com. And please note that Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such.
Thank you. And hello in the chat to Ninja Kitty and Mirwa Jumeau and Ray and T Secret Squirrel and the Clue Channel. Nice to see you guys today. What was particularly interesting to me about the climate discussion, it wasn't about the substance of it. I honestly just haven't spent enough time trying to learn, why is there a controversy around this? What does it mean? What's the substance of this, the climate change argument? I haven't done that, but I do see a lot of passion from other people who I'm not sure how informed they are either. And it seems to be one of these many issues that people take up and become activists for with relatively little information. And this is really, it's kind of, it's fascinating how many of the contemporary issues we have that seem to be united by high levels of passion and low levels of information.
Well, I also have questions around that. I will not get into climate science itself. I'm just not going to do that. But I used to work in adaptation. I think there's a place for adaptation. So the idea that, the climate is changing all the time. So we have to adapt regardless of what origins you think it has. And adaptation is a good idea because we have cities, we have infrastructure, we have all kinds of things that can be affected by different weather patterns. So that's pretty good idea. Mitigation is a different thing. Mitigation is the active attempt to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So that might include planting more trees, or it could go as far as this, geoengineering we talked about. So seeding the atmosphere with certain particles that might dim the sun. So it has like a whole range of different things. So adaptation and mitigation are two strategies on that. But there does seem to be a lot of fervor from climate justice. Climate justice is different. Climate justice is social justice. It's just another arm of, I guess you could, well, it's not really intersectional because it's not identity based, but it's within the social justice umbrella. And not long ago, so I listened to a lot of academic speaking on YouTube out of curiosity, and or meetings, scientific meetings, and the UN panel on climate change basically had a climate justice and gender talk. So I wish I'd remember more details about it, but the UN is doing a lot of stuff on gender, like the new way of viewing gender. Sex is a spectrum and all that, and we all have a gender identity. So when I came across climate change and gender, I had to listen to it. And in the middle of it, there was so when I say justice, it's not necessarily talking about or discussing the merits of advances in science or anything like that. It's literally about how do we enact justice for gender. So it could be there are the global south is going to be more affected. So we have to have certain places, certain actions in place that are more effective for the global south. But when it comes to gender, it's like, well, different genders are affected differently by climate change. And so we have to create policies for that. And it seems a little bit silly, but in the middle of that, I think it was an hour and a half long, there was the climate justice people, because they're not scientists, did a, how would you describe it? Almost like a pantomime or like a little play about climate justice and how it affects different genders differently. So it's difficult to take I'm just finding it difficult to take seriously.
Sorry, I was thinking of them doing it in an interpretive dance.
Well, yes, there was elements of that. Yes. Yes.
And how will they get their tampons, if there's a tsunami, something like that?
And that could be, well, that would be something that would be discussed in the line of the impacts of or how climate impacts gender. And if that's in the global south, well, that's going to have other elements that, like they're really trying to, and this has been going on for a while, really trying to put everything under the umbrella of climate change as climate justice. So I don't know. I've been disconnected from some of that for some time. But when I went back and had a look, there's been some changes. It's very, very ideological. And I think for anybody still, like, I don't know anybody in it anymore, but if you're still in that world and you don't align with some of the social justice, I imagine it's very difficult for you. So I don't know how that's going to be unpicked, because there's some complication in there that I've been disconnected from. So I don't think I can share too much about it other than that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just did a search on climate change and gender, and I came up with, what's this one? There's the National Climate Change Gender Action Plan.
Yeah.
There's environmental lawyer calls for a gender-sensitive international legal framework to protect climate migrants.
Yep.
Yeah, it's just part of the same constellation of weird intersectional justice issues.
Yes.
Yeah. That's pretty fascinating. And it seems to be riling up a lot of kids. A lot of young people. I shouldn't call them kids. Maybe some of them are kids, teenagers, young adults. I mean, there's the
that's another thing that
phenomenon.
There's another thing I objected to, because I noticed a while back it became fashionable, even before I was aware of the gender stuff in school. I noticed it became fashionable to tell young children that the world is ending because of climate change. Mm-hmm. Now, let's assume the world is ending because of climate change, right? Let's just assume that is a fact. I still don't understand why we're saying that to kids. I'm no counselor, psychologist, and I don't know anything about psychology, but it seems to me pretty obvious that that's going to have some pretty negative impacts on young minds. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I noticed is telling young people, it's your job to fix it. It's your job to fix it. Because even when I was still totally aligned with all this, I thought, no, it's the adults' job to fix problems. It's not children's jobs to fix problems. So I have noticed that for quite a while, and I just don't see that as healthy. And I think now we're seeing some of the effects of that, where you see young people who, like you were saying, Leslie, may not have a lot of information outside of the justice, right? Mm-hmm. Having to act for justice and be ideologically inclined to certain types of actions to fight that.
Mm-hmm. There was this series of children's magazines. They were like a monthly magazine that would come out. I think it was called Zoo Books or something like that, or maybe there was another one and it was by the World Wildlife Fund or whoever does these. But I used to get these for my daughters. We got them as a gift subscription when my daughters were little, and my girls are now 28 and 26. So this is a long time ago. It's like 20 years ago. And we'd read them, and they had all these facts about animals and little curious things about different parts of the world, or whatever. It was mostly focusing on animals and wildlife, and they were so heartbreaking to read, because they were always about, oh, this one's going extinct, and this one is going to be, and this, they're so endangered. Yeah. And I would read them and I would feel so sad as we would read them. Like, we'd be enriched by the information, but there was this tone of devastation really in them.
That's what I'm talking about.
I would resubscribe to them because I felt like, well, it was really quite brilliant in a way, because it's like, this is, by buying these magazines, by spending your money for this, and send a little extra donation for the animals. And it was your way of like paying in to this, here, we're going to tell you how sad this is, and then we're going to give you a way to make it better. And your way to make it better was by contributing financially. And so it was like this thing I started to dread. Like I'd have to read this painful story, this painful series of articles, and then I would pay my dues in. And I don't know when we discontinued that, but I wanted to discontinue it for a long time before I did, because I just felt so much guilt. They were really effective in generating guilt.
Yeah, I noticed a shift like that too, even in the UK. Well, throughout my education, it was, so I'm an ecologist and I worked in climate change. So an ecologist looks at natural systems. It could be animals, it could be plants, it could be nutrients in the environment, it could be evolution, it could be a lot of things. But it's the biological study of the natural world and its cycles and systems. And looking back, my entire education was pretty doomsday. Pretty much all we learned was very doomsday. And there are problems. Like, I'm not saying there are not any problems. There absolutely are environmental problems. I would question whether we're focusing on the problems that can actually help or not, but that's a whole other conversation. But I didn't notice that in the public zeitgeist, that doom at the time 20 years ago. But I started noticing. So I left about 2017. I definitely started noticing then all that doom and gloom. And but even then I questioned, is this helpful? If you're giving people a sense of that everything is bad, then what motivation do people have to make it good other than a fervent one, like a sort of negatively pushed fervent one? I don't know. I haven't given these ideas much thought. I wasn't actually expecting to talk about nature and climate change again today, but yeah, I'd like.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to go into it a little bit. Let me go to the chat.
I could kind of segue it a little back to other things we're talking about, which is, this seems like the subversion of childhood innocence, or this ignorance of developmental capacity. And so whether it's with the queer theory stuff or with this, right, it's like as though we don't have to protect a small child's capacities and innocence. We could just dump the most horrible thing on them right this second, and even put on them the adult responsibility to save it. And so with that, or the queer thing, all of it is somehow not recognizing that children are not little adults, that we need to you talk about the word scaffold, Leslie, like you just can't, there's only so much a child can handle, even cognitively and on any other level. And this is just another manifestation of not recognizing that and inverting the adult child relationship.
That is a brilliant segue, because that is precisely what so the concept of childhood innocence, I think, is a very key one here. And I think it applies to a lot of things. And you're right, it does apply to queer theory. I'm sure it applies to pretty much all of this social justice. In Canada, I noticed, whilst reading some of the queer pedagogy literature, in early childhood education, so not just high school or normal pedagogy or sort of older children, but the youngest children, this concept that so there's this thing called developmentally appropriate practice, which is kind of what it does on the tin. It's meant to teach certain topics to children at an age that is appropriate to them, that uses psychology. So they know that, for example, if we're talking about sex ed, you wouldn't teach sex ed to a 5-year-old because it's developmentally inappropriate. So that used to be the pedagogy in Canada. And around the 2010s, I noticed a real critique, so a critical pedagogy type of critique upon developmentally appropriate practice as a sort of, it upheld the idea that children are innocent. And according to the queer theorists that I'm talking about, they viewed children as, or the concept of childhood innocence as a myth. And that myth was invented in Europe. It was invented by the Victorians, and it was meant to keep children away from dangerous knowledge that the adults didn't want them to have. And so they had to dismantle the concept of childhood innocence by queering the classroom. So that's absolutely a thing that you see now. Now they're pretty blatant. So that wasn't as blatant. When I first came across it in the older papers, I had to kind of figure out what they meant by that. But thankfully, in more recent academics, more recent queer pedagogues have been blatantly saying this, and even even more blatantly than I'm explaining it to you now. So this is quite a common concept, this idea that if you keep children innocent, this is only in favor of a white supremacist, Eurocentric ideology that aims to keep children safe from dangerous knowledge or away from dangerous knowledge that could actually emancipate them. And the way that it applies in queer theory is that how do I explain this? Heteronormativity, the idea that the assumption that everyone is heterosexual and cis, or as in not trans, it sort of socially perpetuates itself. It socially reproduces itself, this idea, unless you disrupt it. And the idea of queer in the classroom is that because some queer adults exist now, then they must have been queer youth, and they were oppressed when they were young because of heteronormativity and the childhood perpetuation of heteronormativity. So they want to queer the classroom so they can liberate that much earlier and get rid of that oppression. So it sounds all kind of crazy, but yeah, I put out quite a few clips from Canadian academics saying this recently, which is brilliant because I tried to describe these concepts in some videos that I put together using the researchers' papers themselves. So when I came across it with them saying it so blatantly, it was brilliant.
Yeah, so then it's sort of like, so what if we tell them the world's coming to an end when they're 4, and
they need to know.
Like, it's not going to crush them, and we can't imagine that they're just as hardy and capable and all that as a 20-year-old.
I don't think they view it as they're hardy. I think so. I'm going to steal, man, because that's what I do.
Sure.
I don't think they think that it makes them more resilient or hardy, or they have the capacity to deal with it. It's that you don't want to keep knowledge from them, because doing so would be oppressive, and you want to liberate different knowledges. Children should. So I'm sure you come across the idea that children have agency, and parental rights are a thing. Children's rights are a thing, but not parental rights. Parents have responsibilities. So because children are viewed as having all this agency, then they shouldn't have knowledge kept from them, because that's oppression. I think they understand that it does create vulnerability, but I think that that's okay. That's viewed as being okay, because you're awakening yourself to the systems of oppression that exist all around you that are being kept from you.
It sounds like a way to engender learned helplessness.
Yeah, it's an interesting way of putting it.
I have thought it is. So the whole idea of childhood as this really protected and sacred time is a relatively modern phenomenon. I mean, everything's modern, right? Everything's different than it would have been with our ancestors. But childhood specifically as a very protected little bubble of isolation is sort of a modern cultural phenomenon. A lot of times in the past, the kids would have had to work, had to take more responsibility. They wouldn't have been necessarily sheltered and set aside in these little schools where they're protected from the ordinary goings on and responsibilities of having a family or running a home, or having a homestead or a farm or whatever it would have been that you would have done. And there's a lot of strangeness around it. Like there's the coddling of children, the safetyism. I think that's a particular area to discuss. The helicoptering and the keeping kids from acquiring skills and taking responsibility as they're able to. But then on the other hand, you've got this, which is this like, and they seem to be going hand in hand, which is what's really strange, is we're going to simultaneously rob you of the ability to acquire skills and responsibility, and also expose you to an awful lot of really frightening information that tells you that there's a job for you to do. You need to go out and be an activist. But activism is all about telling other people what they should do to change. It's not about doing anything yourself. And so these are such conflicting and strange messages to send kids. So to me, it does seem like it's a recipe for neuroticism, paranoia, learned helplessness, and just failure to launch, period. Just it seems like a recipe for keeping kids scared of their own shadow.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. You're right. There's a safetyism, but it's protection from ideas that these particular ideologues don't want children to know. So protect them, make them safe from the knowledge that they don't approve of, whilst exposing them to all kinds of information that their parents might not approve of. And that's one thing that I picked up. Can I share something? I want to see if I can share this clip, because I think she can do much better. She could do much better explaining this than I can.
Please do.
Yeah, and I think
it's more than say protecting people from ideas so much, because we see them exposing kids to all kinds of sexual ideas and violence, but it's protecting them from unsupervised experience, which is what's so shocking. Go ahead.
I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but let's have a go. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Beliefs about childhood have been shaped by the myth of childhood.
Can you turn it up a little?
This idea of
I think that's as far as it'll go.
Okay, let's see if it gets better.
what beliefs about childhood have been shaped by the myth of childhood innocence. This idea of childhood as a time when innocence can be traced to 18th century French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's theories about childhood were based on the white middle class able-bodied child. Because Rousseau's ideas about childhood are still pervasive today, the white child is still our paradigm of who deserves protection. He believes that children come from God, are born pure and naturally good, and need to be saved from corruption and molded into responsible adults. These romantic era ideas were classist, patriarchal, and important to the construction and maintenance of whiteness.
It's pretty hard to hear, Melanie. Can you guys hear it better than me?
That is
Can hear it.
You can? Okay.
Constructed categories shaped by differentials of power that enables adults, namely those who are white and colonial, to produce themselves as dominant. Innocence was only granted to white middle-class boys and girls. The poor, the disabled, and the racialized were seen as sinful, uncivilized, and requiring discipline. Punishment for a bad child, aka a poor, disabled, or racialized child, serves two functions: to reinforce the division between the good and the bad child, and to attempt to make the bad child good.
I have so many clips of this nature. But that's the thing. So childhood innocence is a myth rooted in white supremacy that aims to dominate the child and take away their agency and mold them into what adults want them to be, to reproduce, to socially reproduce the desirable cis heteronormative future. And they call this futurity. So this lady, Julia Sinclair Palm, works under another lady called Hannah Dyer, who talks about the futurity of childhood innocence. And futurity is kind of it's a socialist term, and it just means it's the opposite of social reproduction in a way. It's like reproducing the new socialist future, the futurity of those ideas, and disrupting the social reproduction of the oppressive forces. So that's kind of what she's talking about in there.
It's funny that somehow this conclusion, we can't have innocence at all because people were not treating the non-white, the other people not innocent. Like, let's just get rid of the whole idea just because we weren't evenly applying this notion of innocence to all children. Something like that. Like, it's so interesting what they choose. Because there's some of those grains of truth. They're sort of like, well, maybe, yeah, I could think about it like, oh, that is terrible that they probably treated poor children, didn't care, no one, whatever. That is bad, right? But like your conclusion about what the response or the alternative should be is just not very good thinking.
Well, because that would reproduce this heteronormativity that I'm talking about, or the whiteness. So they don't want all children to have access to the privilege of whiteness because that's oppression. So you have to look at the queer family. You have to look at the whatever marginalized family and focus on that. So so I agree with you in the sense that a lot of the things that get said, I believe, have a kernel of truth and can be discussed intellectually and sort of possibly come up with ideas on how we could address these issues. But the solutions are never, well, let's elevate everyone to the best possible scenario, because that is viewed as oppression.
What's interesting is like there's this there's the safetyism and the protectionism, right? The breaking people into little groups that deserve special victim treatment and special coddling. And I guess it seems like it's kind of an over-engineering of the solution to the same problem that's being presented by the overburdening of kids with information. So you're treating kids like they can handle more than they can handle. You're putting guilt trips on them constantly. And then you have certain ones that start to break down and become really, really fragile because of both the lack of agency, but then also the overburdening of fear and anxiety. And then you have people who understandably start to crack under that, but they just create new victim classes. So it's like the whole thing is splintering along the need to categorize everything and put everything into boxes and squares, instead of just understanding that the human experience is much less categorical than that. Like, I even think that when we talk about children, for instance, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a 13-year-old? Are we talking about a 16-year-old? Are we talking about an 8-year-old? What does that mean? And we talk about children and adults as if they are two separate categories, rather than we are humans that go through a childhood and an adolescence and an adulthood. And I think that there's just such an effort to break things down and label and categorize, when a lot of these things are much more fluid than we're able to give them, I guess, credit for, when we're using these kind of technocratic methods.
Although I could see the queer theorists loving that statement, because then they could be like, well, then that 5-year-old is actually probably very sexually developed, and why should you say they're a child? Right? Like, I see both and. I see what you're saying.
Stage theorists, developmental stage theories exist. I mean, you've got Erikson, you've got Piaget. We have this awareness that there are stages that people pass through, but even the stage theorists will give you sort of a range.
Yeah.
They don't break it down into childhood and adulthood. And so this is where I've heard this a lot is people talking about like sex and sexuality or pornography. There's like this, we're going to put age limits on this. So after 18, here it all is. But before you're 18, don't look at any of it. But it's like when you're 18, suddenly everything's okay for you. Like, let's just expose you to the entire world of crazy, kinky BDSM nutso behavior that's out there on the internet. And I guess I find that dividing line kind of interesting. Like, everything's healthy for adults. Adults can handle just complete hedonism and debauchery, but children, protect them completely from any of that. And I think when we think about ourselves as human beings and we look at activities and information and promoting behavior that aims towards human flourishing rather than towards healthy children or healthy adults, but human flourishing. And I just think that that's a much better way to look at all of these things.
I'm going to provide a counterpoint to that.
Okay.
Where I'm personally coming from is, so this person who just spoke in the clip works with small children, works with youth as well, but small children. And so does Hannah Dyer with small kids. So an 8-year-old, right? And I find that pushing these ideas coming from theorists, coming from queer pedagogues into the classroom as a subversion to the parents, and then attacking parents who say, I don't think this is really appropriate, and I'm not super happy that my child is exposed to these things, which is happening a lot in Canada. There's a real pushback against the idea that parents have right to determine the upbringing of their own children and what sort of ideas they want them to be exposed to. That's where I'm coming from in all of this, because I agree with you. I think all children are going to have some different levels of maturity, but the families know that. They're the ones who are around it all the time. And I think that there's some discussion worth having around how do you maintain that within families, and how do you educate families on how to navigate raising children that's inappropriate for them. And then the flip side of what's going on right now in Canada is they're using the law to impose queer theory on schools with a legal strong arm. So there's a toolkit in Ontario that came out called the Trans Affirming Toolkit for Ontario Educators, which I'm constantly talking about. And in the release video for the toolkit from Western University, one of the authors, Kenan Omoragic, discusses how there was a court ruling in Canada that stated that learning or having a religious education alongside a queer education or queer pedagogy invoked or brought about cognitive dissonance. And that was desirable because it essentially created tolerance among young people. I find that very interesting because I think his name is Kevin Kumishara wrote a book about queer pedagogy, and in that book described that teaching queer pedagogy to young children would create a state of cognitive dissonance, but that was desirable. You wanted to bring that about because you wanted to create a crisis within the child so that they could become more tolerant. So these ideas are circulating, this idea of it's okay to create cognitive dissonance in young children because we want to force them to be more tolerant. Like, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know the ins and outs of those ideas, but it seems to me that if a parent doesn't want that, and yet they would get attacked in Canada by some of our politicians for saying no, we're called, so CSIS, our FBI, the equivalent of our, or intelligence agency, whatever, essentially identifies parents like me as a threat, a violent threat to the country or to the LGBTQ community, simply for saying, maybe this is not for every single child, and maybe we should seek broad public consent rather than just impose it and then that attack people who say no. So that's a long way of just saying, I think I agree with you, but I don't agree that this should be done in school or using the education system without first of all, broadly explaining to parents, because most parents don't even understand what's going on. I didn't. So it needs to be broadly discussed, honestly discussed, because when it is discussed, there is a Mott and Bailey going on. And then to seek broad consent from a full, transparent explanation of what some of these queer pedagogues want to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that the compulsory government school system needs to be completely abolished, or at very least heavily restructured, so that we're teaching just extremely basic things to kids, and that the government should have no place in the social education.
The moral education of kids.
Moral education. Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with you on that. I do think that a lot of the reason that so much of this becomes dangerous is because of the scale and the way in which it's being implemented. I mean, families can have these kinds of philosophical discussions among themselves, and with love and care for their own children, come up with the ways that they want to handle this. And kids are going to be exposed to things that create cognitive dissonance. And I don't disagree that it's healthy for kids to experience that and learn to work through that. But for a school system to structures in which they impose on kids by confusing the heck out of them,
without telling parents or informing, like that's where I'm coming from, is the moral.
They're basically performing a social experiment on people's children without the parents' full knowledge and consent, is what it sounds like to me.
Well, that's precisely what's going on. That's why I'm trying to bring this to the public, is that at the end of the day, right now in Canada, and I'm sure in many places of the US, there is a group of individuals, whether here it could be union reps, it could be politicians, it could be people working with our Ministry of Education or some of the academics creating these policies. They've decided that they have the correct moral stance, and they must impose it upon schools. And anyone who may have an objection to that is a problem. That's where I have an issue, because, like I said, do parents know that the intent here is to cause a mental crisis on children for them to become more tolerant? Like, I just want people to, I want honesty. That's what I would like. I would like honesty, and I would like transparency. And then from that, parents can then decide. If we're going to have a public education system that is mandatory, then you have to have consent from the public of what you're doing. We don't have that here.
That's really amazing to me. And this, this notion in terms of queering the schools, that part of the reason for that is because only certain children benefited from childhood innocence, largely white children and middle-class children, according to this idea. The notion that because some children benefited more than others, that then what we should do is take it away from everyone. I mean, that's essentially in its nature a kind of communist idea of let's bring everybody down, let's cut everybody down to size, instead of, well, gee, these people over here seem to have it a bit better. They seem to be more privileged, if you want to use that word. So to me, the idea of a wise idea would be, let's look at how we can extend privilege. But what they want to do is dismantle privilege. And one of the ways of extending privilege in terms of childhood innocence and stability would be to help people to improve their economic circumstances. And a lot of that is done, as we know, statistically, you are much more likely to have that stable, sheltered environment in a two-person family. So a lot of what we call privilege comes from a stable, intact family. And we could extend that by helping people to understand the value of that.
Yeah. Well, from
Or
my
we could just
research,
ruin everything for everybody.
yeah, I think that's kind of where it's going. This because okay, so what I've come across a lot too in the queer pedagogy from the academics here in Canada is that there's an attack on family, but it seems to be specifically the nuclear family. Now, it could be so in a lesser sense, a homonormative nuclear family is less attacked, and it's more so the heteronormative two-parent family. But any kind of stable family or nuclear family in that way is really on the attack. And the reason for that is that, well, queer families exist, and because they have less privilege, then the privilege from the nuclear family is a problem, and that must be dismantled for the benefit of everyone who doesn't fit that mold. So it's the same thing that you were discussing. It's the same thing that you were describing, that because some people have privilege, we have to remove that privilege. And that privilege only exists because of whiteness and because of all these other concepts. And that is an idea that's circulated a lot in these particular theories. But it just seems to be the nuclear family. It doesn't seem to be other kinds of family.
It's as if stigma is or saying that someone has it worse off is the thing that you want to avoid. So, like, for instance, if you can recognize that a stable two-parent family is the healthiest paradigm for human childhood, so we want that, we want to optimize that, then we recognize that that's not always the case. Sometimes there's divorce, sometimes there's death, sometimes there's other circumstances that lead to someone being a single parent or just unfortunate, whatever. It just happens. And so as a society, we create ways to support each other when we find those difficult situations, affecting people. So we find supports for those people. Is there something inherently bad about saying, look, you've got it worse off, so we're going to give you a hand up? Is that the thing that we're trying to avoid when we flatten everybody down? We're trying to say, but victimhood is sort of this special thing at the same time here. I'm just completely rambling now, but
well, there's a duality because
yeah,
there's the centering of the marginal. That's always going to be the praxis, if you will. But there's also, well, no, we wouldn't want to give them supports to then conform to the white supremacist nuclear family model, because that upholds patriarchy and all these other concepts. So we then have to create a situation where we encourage or we celebrate all kinds of families that are not nuclear families. So it could be, oh, my brain is not working today. What is it when someone has lots of partners? Polyamory. So like a polyamorous, polycule family, like that would be what you would want to center. And you would never try to give them supports to, create an environment like a nuclear family, because that would be denying their inherent right to be who they are, kind of thing. So there's all these like contradictory concepts that sort of float around, certainly in queer theory, because that's what I spend most of my time on, and people who follow sort of queer doctrine. But yeah, there's a lot of contradictions. So they're both marginalized and should be given special privilege because of marginalization, but also don't marginalize them because they're just as valid as everyone else and we should encourage them. So I'm also very confused by these ideas.
Well, also the liberation piece, I mean, this might be going off rails, so we'll come back to something else if it doesn't, but I was listening to like Aaron McIntyre and this whole the total state. It's like the more we free people from the matrix of these whatever cis hetero blah, 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 patriarch blah, 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 there's this liberation supposedly, but it seems like then the state just comes in more from the top in terms of directing, controlling. So how liberated is anybody like anyway? I'm not entirely sure. You know, looks like it on some level. I get to do what I want, right? But then
oh my God, that's like a whole topic. So
yeah, that might
clearly,
be two other topics.
Well, it's linked. It's linked. Clearly, a lot of this is driven by socialist praxis. It's driven by Marxist practice, communist practice, whatever you want to call it. Now, that's not to say that everyone who follows these ideas is a Marxist or anything like that. I think there's a lot of well-meaning liberal types who are very sympathetic to these ideas, who enable a lot of them, but it's certainly driven by radical individuals. And that liberation you're talking about is common amongst so many different areas. So it's the idea is to liberate from the state, liberate from neoliberalism, and because you see this in the literature as well, and you hear it in their meetings, liberating from the oppressive capitalist state or whatever. And so that's very, very common among queer theorists. I call it queer Marxism here in Canada. But what does that liberate from? And you're right. And so here in Canada, we see our government, the Liberal and NDP governments here, are very, very keen to support many of these liberation ideologies. And if you follow, I started following a bit more socialist accounts and try to understand the socialism a little bit more, because that's not really something that I understood very well. And in there, you do hear a lot about some of the more revolutionary communists, revolutionary socialists, often talking about the state having control. So they want the state to have control. They don't want the Liberal and NDP to have control. They want the people to have control. So it would be, and it's described all the time, this like people's government where everybody votes all the time on absolutely everything, but it would be the government that controls absolutely everything in a collectivist way. So that is something that the praxis is driving towards. It's just that I think, and this is just my assessment of the situation, here in Canada, our current government is taking advantage of that situation. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. But the ultimate aim of a lot of this is to have a sort of collectivist government of the people. Like that is absolutely something that these individuals are driving towards.
But they still want to decide, right, what that'll look like. Because if they really wanted to know what people wanted and what people's opinions and goals and desires are, like you said, this sort of queering of the school would be happening by parental consensus. So it's kind of like the formula has been decided upon and it's going to be imposed.
Yeah, but no, because if you're not, this is my understanding, if you are part of the people being the socialists, basically, if you are part of the people, then your vote counts. If you are not part of the people, you are an enemy of the people, and so your vote does not count. And so parents who are speaking out like myself, our vote doesn't count. Our information doesn't count. It's not important.
Like you've been kind of depersoned, like it's very objectifying. Well, you have wrong think, so therefore we're not even going to count you, because literally your opinion is just, it cannot even be valid. It's not that we disagree with it, it's that it's not even within the realm of feasibility.
That's
what I understand.
Exactly what happened with Trump.
Yeah,
with the
Trump
supporter.
Right.
Sorry, Melanie, go ahead.
I'm getting too excited. I love these topics. That's what you've just described, Jennifer, is my understanding of why people keep getting called homophobic, transphobic, racist, all these things, regardless of or whether or not they actually are bigot, turf, whatever, all of these things, is because I think what that really means is you are not of the people. You are an outsider. And so we have to identify you as the outsider. Here in Canada, I think a really good example of that is the unions. So the unions are massive. And I think, I'm not entirely 100% sure, but I'm 90% sure that the public service is the #1 employer, I think, here in Canada. So I've only been here a few years, so I'm not 100% sure on this, but it's a big employer. And the unions are massive too, whether it's in the public sector or private sector. And even within the unions, you have you have the front of the union amongst the workers is they will be fighting for rights and privileges or whatever. They'll be working with employers for labor rights, right? So they're very labor focused, better pay, better vacation, all these types of things. But there's another realm of the unions. They become a major, I think there's Unifor, it's made a monopoly of all these unions, and there's like an executive branch that does not have votes. So union members do not vote for some of these things that the unions do, and they advocate for essentially socialist revolution. So right now we have a queer Faye Johnstone, who is a very well-known queer activist, developed a company and received, I don't know, like $1.2 million from the government to do this like queer momentum. They call them queer momentum. And right now there's like a queer week of action or something, protests all over the country that mimic the 1 million March for Children from last year.
Oh, gosh.
And they've kind of teamed up with this guy called Fred Hahn from one of our unions, CUPE, which is a massive union. And this guy's constantly at Palestine for any kind of protest. So there's like socialist revolutionary praxis kind of happening, or it's agitation sort of happening. And that doesn't get votes from the union members. Now, before the million marches last year, a few days before, there were execs from some of these unions who had a Zoom call, and it was leaked by some people in our network, and it was leaked to the public. And in there, they were organizing this. Their union members had no idea about this, by the way, because many of the union members would have been at our parents' rights protest, basically. But they were organizing against parents, telling them they wanted to give them a fright, telling them they wanted to intimidate them by taking pictures of people's license plates, calling them Nazis, calling them all kinds of things like that. And I think it woke up a lot of people who are part of unions, who often you don't have a choice. You have to be part of the union. You have to pay dues. But you don't have a right to vote on some of the things that these people are using the union dues for. And it's a really big problem. Now, I know I'm going off on some union things, but they're all sort of interlinked. And there's a lot of power and influence behind, especially the queer stuff in Canada, but not even just queer. Like it could be some of the critical race theory. I mean, our government has policies where you have to hire for certain intersectional qualities. I think in the universities as well. So there's a lot of power and influence behind these things. And I don't think most Canadians really fully realize the amount of push and money that's behind this. And we get accused by some of the activists of being well-funded. We have no money. We're all volunteers, you know? But yeah, it's a problem. And I do think there's the goal is to I don't know. I just feel like they really have people who have access to power, who are using these ideas to kind of further their own causes. That's what it feels like to me.
I'm going to read a couple of chats. We have a super chat from the Clue channel. Thank you very much. Who says, the national gender climate change sounds like a place of truth to me. And a couple of people said that the magazine I was thinking of was Highlights. I think we did get Highlights too, but I'm pretty sure this was like a specific like animal one, but thank you. And let's see. Ray says, when I was a child in the early 70s, Hobo Kelly, a TV kids show, would fly in the sky and say the names of kids she could see. When Hobo Kelly said my name, I was in bliss. When Leslie said my name this morning, I was in 1970s childhood bliss. Oh, that's
It's like Romper Room. Remember Romper Room?
So
Icy.
Oh man. Let's see. Good Grief says, it never made sense to me that trans are the most oppressed, but that transing kids somehow keeps them from harm. That's interesting.
Oh, like you're making them into the oppressed class.
I guess so. That's an interesting, yeah. And let's see, scrolling through a bunch of chats. Thank you guys for all your engagement here. Good Grief also says, a former coworker of mine had an embryo implanted in herself and is now raising the baby as an X. She screams at people when they know it's obviously a boy. Yeah, the whole they be phenomenon, the whole gender creative child. Maybe we could talk about that sometime. That's really interesting. Ray sends a super chat. Thank you very much. And says, have any of the four of you started reading Abigail Schreier's new book, Bad Therapy?
Not yet.
Have you?
Not yet.
Not yet. I'm about halfway not quite, about a third of the way through with it. It's on my bed. Yeah, I'm really enjoying it. I have some questions and some qualms, but mostly I really enjoy her thesis and agree with a lot of what she's saying. So I'll have to, maybe if anybody wants to read that with us, we can do a book report together someday. Let's see. 97 cents. We assume that adults would have some level of good sense to avoid the extreme stuff where someone who's exposed to that in childhood might not. I think that's a response to my comment earlier. And there was another one that I really wanted to read in here. Where was it? It is, there's something about unions. Lawrence W. Unions seem to strike and disrupt small businesses and people's ability to work or get to work. They don't affect their employer when they strike. T Secret Squirrel, could you imagine being told to never assume what someone's sexuality is? This notion is conspicuously absent in today's SJW climate. Well, and then Ninja Kitty says the sexual revolution was horrendous for both men and women, but I would argue more so for women, as they now have to deal with the men that were created by it. That's interesting. Here's one. I wanted to read this one. Good grief. What is it in human nature that makes humans want to feel that the world is going to end? Any thoughts?
Yeah, there's that apocalyptic, always looming thing, right?
It must be something to do with a reflection of our own consciousness, our own end, maybe, and our fear of that and fascination with it.
Yeah, I always took that as a fear of death. Yeah, it's this understanding that life is finite, this fear of death, but also that panic does provide an awful lot of motivation. When life is easy, you take it easy. You don't feel pressure to act really passionately about things, or many people don't. But if you have this looming thing that's coming at you, that's certainly a very motivating factor to have purpose in your life. Anyway, that's how I kind of understood it.
And that's one thing I have, is probably another topic another time, but I have wondered about is, say there was something, it was really true, it was really looming, and we need to get on it. I do wonder sometimes, would people have the motivation to get on something they have to really get on right away and mobilize? And I don't know. We've used all these fear things and this other stuff, which I don't like either. But I do wonder sometimes people kind of go, I'm just gonna watch Netflix and hang, like I don't know.
But how could you tell the difference?
I don't know. Hopefully there'll be people well, I guess if you immediately have, like, there's a building's on fire next door, right? Like, then it's like, okay, someone's going to mobilize or whatever. That's an obvious. So I guess it's harder when it's not completely obvious. Especially something that has some time lag in it, right? It's not like the second, but you need to do some things ahead of time. And so I don't know. I don't know the answer of things that might require some preparation but not scaring people into it. Maybe we just have to deal and adapt. If we didn't do whatever, we have to then adapt if there was something that happened.
97 cents says, Deborah, we mobilized on the ozone layer.
That's true. Did they scare people a lot? I remember I was scared of, like, aerosols.
I was scared of using hairspray.
Oh yeah. I remember that.
But that is good. We did.
It was the era when your bangs were supposed to be like this too. So I used a lot of hairspray.
Yeah. Well, the refrigerators too. Like, I don't know if that was more of an industrial thing. And then once they got the industries to stop doing the thing, that worked.
There was public education. So that's why we would fear using hairspray. But most of that was done through policy. So it wasn't a fear-mongering campaign.
But it was policies I think we would probably find acceptable. It's like different than, say, we're going to do a 15-minute city on you, or we're going to have cameras where your car is going.
Somehow just agreements to change certain things.
Yeah, I think maybe asking companies to do things is a little less upsetting to us as just individuals sitting out here than telling us you can't have meat and you can't have whatever.
Yeah, Helena Blavatsky says, didn't get a notification. You're probably talking about the live stream. There's not right now. I don't have it set up to notify anybody. We just pop on predictably every Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific. one of these days I'm going to figure out a different platform than Zoom that allows me to set up the live stream ahead of time, but that's where we are right now. Thank you for the super chat, Andrew Joyner. That's very nice. And any final thoughts, ladies, as we come to the close of the hour?
I'm just sitting here wondering what Canada, the United States, the West in general, what it will look like, 20 years from now with this effort to queer everything, just what will the impact of that be on relationships and how we live our lives and the quality of our life. And I don't know the answer to that.
I don't. I think there's going to have to be a lot of deprogramming. I think it's going to take some effort. I think we have to really talk about realities, our biological realities. We have to fight this idea that everything is oppression and empower people to actually do positive things with their lives and enact meaningful change and not necessarily try to impose change on other people. Like all of these things, I hope will change, but I think it's going to take a long time. And I think certainly young people may take an even longer time to come around. But I agree with you. I don't know what that's going to look like. I think it's up to us. It's not up to the kids to change everything. Even with this stuff, we hear, oh, the kids are fighting back. It's all down to the kid. The kids are going to change this. I don't know. I think we did this, and it's up to us to try to make an impact and to try to make a change.
I'd say the last thing I'd say is anything we learn about, I mean, this has happened over and over in history, but like what makes, what lets people succumb to these things, having more public awareness of human tendency to fall into particular streams of thinking and not be able to just speak openly, like just more meta awareness of this herd sort of thing. I mean, I don't know if we can ever stop it because people do it, but more just, and not even major blaming, like I can't believe these people did it, but just like, wow, like look what was going on in your life such that you felt like you couldn't speak up. How can we design some things better to prevent that? That's sort of conversation I'd like to see.
I think that the issue of mass communication is the reason why we're seeing the splintering into identitarianism. I think mass communication is a problem. Communicating at scale, even having these really large schools with thousands of kids versus small classrooms and small schools where we work with people on more of an individual basis. As soon as you zoom out big enough that you can no longer perceive individuals, you have no other way to reconstitute the human in front of you other than using categories, putting people into boxes. And I think that there's a fundamental dehumanization in that process, in the process of zooming out and trying to communicate at too big a scale. Like that's why we see so much difficulty in communicating across social media. People don't perceive the other as a human anymore. We don't feel the humanity anymore. We don't have the right amount of empathy. And so this is all this bizarre reconstituting and restructuring that we're trying to do. And I think that the identitarianism is a natural byproduct of that. And it'll be really interesting to see what happens from here. I think we have to let go of outcomes when it comes to other people. And that the comical trope of the Karen, which is this funny meme, but really we're all really caught up in other people's outcomes in a way. There's this desire to control other people's behavior. I think all of us need to take a step back from that and start respecting the autonomy of other people and remembering that other people are individuals on a level that we can't even perceive, and letting go of some of that. I believe that's, I don't know, I'm going on a rant now, so maybe I'll save that rant for another time.
Good rant.
Very good rant.
Melanie, it's really awesome to speak with you. I'm so glad you could join us today. Thanks for this great conversation.
No worries, super fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And as always, thank you, Jennifer and Deborah. And thank you to everybody in the chat. I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you guys next week.